Sorry.
All right, well, thank you so much, Rob, for having me. This is my first EFL talk. I'm very excited to be here. And today I'm talking about developing an inclusive international classroom by providing a safe space for all gender identities. In addition to my PhD, I have a graduate certificate in women and gender studies. So this is also a topic very near and dear to my heart. Just a really brief outline is I'm going to talk about using pronouns, gender identity and expression terms, using a continuum in class as to how I introduce this topic. And I'm also going to share a few student reflections that my students shared with me at the end of this. So the first thing about using pronouns is that a couple of years ago, TESOL International released the 6 principles for exemplary teaching of English learners. And the first principle is to know your learners. Now, this is really important when you have to understand how they learn, whether they're kinesthetic, whether they're visual, but it's also crucial to understand their backgrounds, their culture, their identity. And so to provide a space for them to be able to share that where it's comfortable is very important. In addition, as Robin mentioned, there is a they, and the APA 7th edition, as well as other style books, have recognized and welcomed the singular they. So gone are the days of having to write he or his or her or what have you. And also not everyone identifies as a he or her. And of course, now, as you might see from companies and different universities, it's now part of many email signatures. In fact, mine has my she, her, and it also has a what is this? So people can click on the link and understand why people are identifying their pronouns. It's also part of a lot of diversity and inclusion statements at the university. So, for example, where I am employed, it has a whole myriad of understanding, sustaining a community of free inquiry in which people of diverse race, ethnicity, veteran status, et cetera, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So right now in the United States, where I teach a variety of international students, it was important for me, for them to also understand the different types of people who a lot of them are openly out, some of them are not, but maybe they're going to sit next to somebody who may identify as a he or her, he or his, and they have to be able to understand that, or at least tolerate it, at least understand and be prepared for it. So there are at least 64 gender identity and expression terms, and here are just a few. We have cisgender, transgender, agender, bigender, gender forthcoming, gender neutral, gender queer, gender binary. So it's always just important not to assume, not to guess, but you can ask because you don't really know how they identify. And when I started this whole thing, I was very aware of he and she and they and them and their. There's a whole bunch of different ways that people can identify with their pronouns. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is just an idea of the different types of pronouns that are out there and how people identify. And it's very important to be able to give a space for them to be able to do that, and also to be aware of the various gender identifications. And so the way I handle this gender identification is that I have a get to know you survey, and it has a space for a preferred pronoun, or rather just pronoun. It's completely optional. Students do not have to identify. It introduces pronoun usage in the classroom. And I also introduce the diversity and inclusion statement regarding why I'm doing this. Now, I had students many times in the past that say, okay, so my name is, and they'd say their name and say, I'm a he, and then from say, I'm a she. And so a lot of them were very confused at first, like, well, of course I'm he, of course I'm she. But then I basically really quickly identified that not everybody identifies as a he or a she. But I don't get into the intricacies of the gender identity quite yet, because it's very important to understand the different cultures and having that cultural sensitivity for the different backgrounds, cultures, and values that I might have, and to understand this is a completely new topic for many people, and for some people it may not be as unfamiliar. And so what I do is I introduce a continuum, and I have my students introduce a few hot topics to discuss, and I have them choose because I want to make sure they're all generally comfortable with talking about these different topics. And one semester, for example, I had gun control and climate change. So I had students explore the topic without taking a side. And I showed a variety of sources that describe different perspectives. I had my students also explore depending on what level they were. I divided the class into groups to describe the different perspectives. And then I had them place their perspectives that they found on a continuum of this is absolutely right, or this is absolutely wrong, like gun control, or climate change absolutely exists to climate change, okay, it doesn't exist. And they were able to put those perspectives on a continuum and come to a conclusion that there's no necessarily right or wrong answer, and that all these different perspectives coming together bring a fuller picture as to how the world is viewing these very important topics. And so then I was ready to introduce, with a little more carefully, gender identity continuums. Now, I was able to do this, number one, with the approval of my my administration, to let them know what was happening in case I had international students get very upset or uncomfortable. Even though I explained, I tried to do everything step by step, it was very important for me to get my administration on board. And also, I was able to get a guest speaker from the Diversity and Inclusion Office and Women and Gender Studies Office. And so we were able to partner together to do a workshop with the gender person and also the gender unicorn. And so I started with the gender person because it kind of, simplifies it a little bit more if people are very if people are very new to this whole idea. And so you have gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, sexual orientation, and you can see the different continuums. And so because my international students were so exposed to the continuum and understanding that maybe not everything is over here and not over here, they were a little bit more amenable to looking at this idea of gender identity on a continuum and understanding not everyone identifies as male, as feminine, masculine, woman, man, female, male, and even heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual. Now, the one at the bottom, I didn't really do as much with. I just really wanted to make sure they understood the gender identity. And as I did this more, I got more into the gender unicorn, which is a bit more complex. But again, depending on your classroom diversity, depending on the culture, even depending where in the world you are, you may want to use all of or part of these different gender identity continuums to be able to not just explain the gender identity, but also to give a space for students to be able to understand and explore for themselves. And so I have a few student reflections, actually. And the one thing I did want to mention as well is that when I had the guest speaker come, before I did, I had a student raise their hand and say, oh, what is their pronoun preference? So we know how to address them. And so that made me realize, well, I really started to do my job. And so after we talked about the gender identity, gender continuums, I asked my students to reflect upon what they had learned. And there's a few topics about how you can identify yourself how you want. I learned a lot of important things, how to discuss and respect all different genders. I learned how to treat these guys well. They learned how trans struggle to change and how much it costs. A lot of people who might be LGBTQ have a societal barrier. We should understand them at least. I want to understand them. And so these are very important student reflections to me, because a lot of students were willing to understand different genders, different identities. But the other thing to also understand is that we could also have students in our classroom who may not identify as gender binary. They may very well be gender non-binary. And even if they do not come out, or they don't feel comfortable coming out in the class or even to you, you know that we're at least providing that safe space for them to be able to do so if they ever felt comfortable, but to also understand that they are accepted and they are welcome in the class, and at least like in my classroom space. And so very important for me to be able to be as inclusive as possible, and also to be able to translate that to remote learning, even if we're not in the classroom together. So that was what I wanted to share. And again, feel free to adapt, use as much or as little as you want to. I know that that depends on wherever we are in the world, but it's also so important to be able to provide a space for gender identity and understanding. So thank you so much. That is all I have.